If you've been watching my channel, you know I love all things negotiation. Negotiation in movies, negotiation on TV, in families, in business, in courts, in sports. But the current standoff between the United States and Russia over the detainment of women's NBA basketball star Brittney Griner has to be the mother of all negotiation dilemmas. Now, the media coverage on this story has failed to uncover many of the dimensions where the situation raises, honestly, some of the thorniest issues that negotiation strategists and diplomats face. So today, I'm going to take my turn at unpacking this negotiation mess, and I'm going to offer some key considerations that should inform the Biden administration's negotiation strategy. I'm Bob Bordone, and I spent 21 years on the Harvard Law School faculty, where I founded and directed the school's negotiation and mediation clinical program. Let's go. So first, a quick factual recap. I think most people know that Brittney Griner is one of the WNBA's most storied professional players of all time. And in fact, she has also led the U.S. Olympic team to 2 gold medals, one in 2016 and the other in 2020. So in February of 2022, as Griner was entering Russia to play in Russia's Premier League because it was off-season in the U.S., she was detained by Russian authorities because they alleged she had cartridges containing hashish oil that were found in her luggage. So fast forward to May of 2022, and the US at this point had stated that Griner was, quote, wrongfully detained. And just to be clear about what that means, diplomatically, it's actually escalating this conflict. So wrongfully detained Griner, then ultimately in July, pleads guilty to the charges of having cannabis in a Russian court, stating, however, that she did not intend to break the law. Between February and this recording, Griner's detention, I think most of us know, has become one of the thorniest and honestly most high-profile detentions of an American citizen in recent history. So countless professional athletes, stars, public figures have all called for the release of Griner, and they have urged the Biden administration to secure that release without delay. And in fact, in June, dozens of organizations representing people of color, women, LGBTQ people, all demanded that President Biden strike a deal for her release. There's even now a giant movement called We Are BG, designed to pressure the Biden administration to bring Brittney home. These many public calls for the administration to act swiftly have created this enormous political pressure. And it's the kind of pressure that actually, from a negotiation perspective, can hurt efforts in the across-the-table negotiation with the Russians. Why is that the case? Well, the more the Russians see that Biden's diplomatic prowess is being judged on his ability to be successful in negotiating Brittney's release, the more the Russians dig in and hold out for more. Now, making this even more complicated in the US context are all the issues of race, gender, sexual orientation, and privilege that complicate perceptions domestically on what the administration does or doesn't do with respect to negotiations around Brittney's release. Now, if that were not complicated enough, let's not forget the state of diplomatic relations between the United States and Russia at this moment. They are worse than they have ever been since the Cold War. Add to this fact, though, that at the time of Brittney's detention, there are actually 64 other U.S. nationals that are being held by foreign governments against their will. Most of them receive no media attention and no support for their cause. What you have here is a giant mess of diplomacy, politics, perception, and precedent. So deciding whether to negotiate with hostage takers, in general, always raises a whole bunch of complicated and ethical and strategic questions. But add to this the added complexity that the person being held in unlawful detention is not being held by a rogue lone wolf hostage taker, but rather by a nation state. We're just in like negotiation, advanced level. So the question number one, right, is should the United States negotiate for the release of Brittney at all? Or should they negotiate on behalf of any unlawfully detained person? And the answer to this question from a negotiation perspective, in my mind, is decidedly yes. So I want to remind you all what I mean when I say negotiation. A negotiation is any communication between two or more persons with an intention to influence or to persuade. So people who say that communicating through proper diplomatic channels to secure the release of one of our citizens is a sign of weakness honestly misunderstand why it is a country has diplomats at all, why it is a country has a State Department or a foreign ministry. Now, of course, there are other important considerations that need to be addressed. So it's one thing to decide to negotiate. It's one thing to say we're going to engage in communications to influence or persuade the actions of the Russians. It's another thing to decide that the thing we're going to negotiate is a prisoner swap. Let me be clear again. I'm not saying that the idea of a prisoner swap in and of itself is concerning. In fact, throughout all of American history, the United States has negotiated prisoner swaps with countries with whom we were at war while we were at war with them. But when we go down the path of prisoner swaps, there are some important questions that need to be asked. One of them is, how do we evaluate the moral equivalence of a swap? It's one thing, for example, to exchange a soldier for a soldier. It's quite another thing to exchange a high-profile basketball star who was caught with a bit of cannabis for Victor Bout. So that's where this negotiation has turned to, by the way. Who is Victor Bout? Victor Bout is an international arms dealer who's currently being held by the United States, who has literally been called the Merchant of Death. And yet this is where we find ourselves, right? The United States apparently has offered Victor Bout in exchange for Brittney Griner and Paul Whelan. So Paul Whelan is a second American being held by the Russians. He's a former Marine that the Russians accuse of being involved in espionage. So the American Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was lambasted recently, at least in part, because there's this concern, right, that Brittney is being used as a pawn to secure the release of someone who, by all accounts, is a true dastardly criminal. So when you decide to negotiate a prisoner swap, you need to be very careful that exchanges are perceived as equivalent. Now, there are other questions you should be asking, though. So the second one, what precedent are you setting when you engage in a prisoner swap? So remember, there are 64 other Americans who are currently being held against their will in foreign countries. Most of these, up until now, have been urged by the State Department to keep their cases quiet, right? Their families have been told that if you publicize the case, it's going to make the negotiation harder. But now, the families of these 64 detained Americans see the American State Department prioritizing a negotiation on behalf of a prominent sports star and caving to public pressure because obviously these constituencies are incredibly important to President Biden, while their own family members lag in detention, many of them in inhumane conditions. So when this happens, right, it's unlikely that the 64 families are just going to sit back and continue to remain quiet. And indeed, just a few days ago, because of these Brittney negotiations, many of these families have come together and they formed a new and vocal public campaign that's called Bring Our Families Home. The campaign had a press conference to shed more light on some of the really harrowing and sad stories of their family members being wrongly held in foreign countries. And they even now have put up a mural of their detained relatives in an upscale Washington, D.C. neighborhood to bring attention to their plight. So I think you can see how this decision to do this public negotiation with the Russians has presented a lot of new problems. Because if every single detainee can now be turned into a political pawn by another nation with a presidential administration that has to respond to internal political pressures, it will simply incentivize countries to take a hostage here or there and then blackmail the all-powerful United States government. And so this raises a third important question. If you do decide to negotiate, what is the best way to do that? This is complicated, right? Given the global media attention on this case and the particular resonance it has in the US because of Brittney's popularity and fame, it's pretty hard to keep the fact and the content of these negotiations quiet. And yet I would say from a best practices perspective, this is exactly what the US should strive to do. So at first glance, one might question Secretary of State Blinken's decision to publicly announce the near deal that happened between Russia and the United States, right? The question is, was this a negotiation mistake? Now, I might say this. With respect to securing Brittney and Whelan's freedom, it actually might be a bit of a setback. But I suspect that when Secretary of State Blinken announced that a possible deal was in the works, part of what he was trying to do was satisfy the domestic political constituency that wanted to know and see the Biden administration working hard on this negotiation. So even though this announcement led to an immediate condemnation from the Russian spokesman, right? The Russian spokesman called for, quote, discreet talks instead of, quote, American megaphone diplomacy. The public announcement allows the administration to show that we are working really hard to close this deal. When the Russians decried the megaphone diplomacy, it allowed Blinken to say, see, look, the Russians are the problem, not us. They're the ones negotiating in bad faith. Now, since that time, it seems to me at least, things have fallen a little bit quiet, or at least at the moment of this recording. Is that because nothing is happening behind the scenes? I doubt it. Though I have no inside knowledge here, I would be very ready to bet that the theatrics are now over, and both sides now are trying to negotiate the details in secret, without the glare of the public light, and in the hope that they will be able to announce some kind of deal. Now, at some level, Blinken has got part of what he needed. He was able to create the perception that securing Brittney's release is a top priority for the administration. But of course, at least at the time of this recording, he still needs to close the deal. And the Russians are going to require a pound of flesh to be able to produce something that they can call a win for themselves, right? We know there is no love lost between the United States and Russia at this moment. So the challenge here is any outcome has to provide a way that each side can say that they have won the day here. You know, for those of you who watch my negotiation videos, you know that I spend a lot of time talking about mutual gains. And frankly, I believe most negotiations do offer mutual gains. But when it comes to a hostage negotiation like this, I'm afraid to say that we're really not negotiating mutual gain. What we're really doing here is negotiating loss mitigation. So that's what's in play here. But of course, that doesn't mean a negotiator walks away. When we're faced with a challenging situation like a hostage negotiation, negotiators have to ask themselves a few questions. First, what precedent are we setting? Second, how do we manage our internal constituencies successfully? Third, how do we create the privacy we need to forge an agreement without seeming we're simply creating a backroom deal? And fourth, how do we avoid setting a bad precedent? So however the Brittney Griner situation turns out, and I sincerely and passionately hope it leads to her release as well as the release of Paul Whelan, one thing is for sure. Doing an after-action review of this negotiation is going to help us glean lessons for how to be better prepared for such negotiations in the future. Now, if you want to hear a happier story of a mutual gains win in negotiations, please watch this next one, which is the story of how the Women's Soccer Association and the National Soccer League were able to create real value and achieve pay equity in sports. Okay, click, you know you want to hear about soccer and value creation.